Okay, so let's get started then. We're going to completely base our lecture today on what we learned last week and specifically focus in on the popular memory phase. Do you remember that? Popular memory phase has two parts. First, remember, it was the filmmakers themselves and what approaches they took to make a film and looking at how and why they chose the films that they did. But also looking at the audience and how the audience changes over time. Looking at how the contemporary frame of reference for the audience changes from when it was first made till later audiences watching the film. So looking at these early films, think about these two things and how they play a role in what we're doing this week and next week, and in the readings as well. So let's begin by going back to Macy's department store in Herald Square, New York, on April 23rd, 1896, where in the Coster and Bale Music Hall, there to a packed house, the audience witnesses something new and amazing. They watch waves crashing on the beach, a comic boxing exhibition, two young women dancing, and also they get to see this. Yep, that's right. That's the first kiss recorded on film, and it was scandalous. That little video was certainly breathtaking for the audience in the late 1800s. And in New York City, the New York Times described that cinematic experience as being wonderfully real and singularly exhilarating. Was it exhilarating for you? Maybe the audience has changed a little bit, but some things remain the same. Now again, going back to what I said last week about how to use humanities in film and using popular memory phase, we could look at movies and how the audience reacts to film, and these early films are a good example. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, filmgoers found that film was action-packed and exhilarating, but it might lose its lust and grandeur today. My favorite example is the world's first cowboy western film that came out around in 1903 called The Great Train Robbery. If you've ever seen the movie Tombstone, they start the movie off with clips from this film. It was written, produced, and directed by a guy named Edward Porter, who started as one of Edison's cameramen. But when the audience first saw it in theaters, they were shocked with all the action. There was shooting, there was explosions, there was even a fight on top of the train, and people complained that it was too real, and people even were documented of getting motion sickness from watching it in the theater. A lot has changed over the century. What would the audience do with a film like this? They'd absolutely freak. Plus, they wouldn't have a clue what to do with the flying scorpion-looking things. But you get my point. The earliest of films by the turn of the 1900s were primarily focused actually on very scandalous and risque sexual imagery, with some humor, but really portraying the burlesque halls of the back streets and red districts of the city. It wasn't something that you would take a girl on a date for the first time, let's say. But as audiences changed, the movies changed, and began to become more sophisticated in manner, it really started to highlight the Victorian ideals and the changes of Victorian ideals to something new. And movies became a catalyst of how society in America was to act and to change. As I've said before, movies offer us a chance to go back in time and try to experience what someone of the past experienced, and try to get our minds and worldviews to understand what they thought, what they felt, and how they reacted to certain things, the values that they held, things that they feared, things that they loved. Perhaps one desire that remains consistent throughout human history is that to go where no man or woman has ever gone before. And in 1902, a trip to the moon became possible in the amazing film released by Georges Méliès with genius theoretical storytelling and visual fantasy, telling a story about astronomers that travel to the surface of the moon and using clever cuts and dissolves and creative costumes and amazing lighting and props and layered paints to give depth and other amazing special effects that were way ahead of its time. One thing I challenge you to look for in movies as we watch, and you watch movies in our class or see clips on Facebook, is to look for the Zeitgeist. The Zeitgeist, a great German term that translates to spirit of the age. It means, and the way we kind of use this term is, what's the spirit of the time it was made? What can the film tell us about the audience and its spirit of the age, its zeitgeist? What is the dominant set of ideals that motivate the actions of what we are viewing? How does it show what society really values at a particular period of time? Think about when you go on social media. What does our cultural values based on what people are tweeting about or posting on Facebook, or what YouTube blogs or other type of media or news coverage or movies coming out in the theater, what do they say about our society? What can they show us is the zeitgeist today? Imagine 100 years from now, people looking back on society based on these things of our media and the movies. And likewise, what do we say about movies 100 years ago? A lot has changed in the values. We'll look at this when we watch our first movie, but it's really important to think 100 years from now or 100 years prior, how we could use film and use different media and different ways that we document, again, the human experience to figure out what the spirit of the age is and this zeitgeist. One film that really highlights the certain zeitgeist of the early 1900s is the notorious film Birth of a Nation by the great film director D.W. Griffith. He's also credited of moving the film industry out of New York, where the weather was really limited film production, and renting buildings in New York was extremely expensive. But they decided to move to a farm region that was cheaper and the weather was reliable, and set their Reliance Majestic Studios, later called Fine Art Studios, which was in partnership with the Triangle Film Corporation and Keystone. He was born in a farm in Kentucky, the son of a man named Roaring Jake Griffith, who was a colonel in the American Civil War on the South, on the Confederate Army, and saw firsthand as a child the poverty that was created after the Civil War, and the poverty he faced, and the poverty that him, his family, and the people around him blamed on the outcome of the war. So he put these views and the sentiments that was written in the book The Klansman, and used this zeitgeist, the spirit of this age, of this views of post-Civil War America, and put it into a big blockbuster movie that came out in 1915, and one of the very first feature-length films, whereas most of the films of the time were about 15 minutes, but the stuff that they produced in this film was even more controversial. It had even more disturbing imageries and ideas that tore the country apart. It depicts the South before the Civil War, its destruction, and the fight during the war, and the horrible aftermath portrayed in a very negative light, all depicting very controversial depictions of slavery and views of the African Americans. In fact, despite its success in the theaters, one statement said that they lost track how much money they made, but regardless of how much money this movie made, it caused race riots around the country. Cities were on fire, literally, as parts of and communities burnt theaters down and tried to stop people from going to see this movie. In fact, even the NAACP were successful in banning this film in many cities. It's a really fascinating study in itself, and it's talked about in detail in Chapter 2 of the readings this week, so really get into that. It's very interesting. This movie, in our context, Birth of a Nation, shows quite well the anxieties of the Civil War, after the Civil War of the South, high tensions of the race relations of the early 20th century. But also, when you view it and you look at this, it also makes you wonder perhaps how much has really changed in the last 100 years if you look around what's happening today. It's an interesting thing to think about. However, Griffith didn't want to be remembered for just creating a movie that created race riots around the country, so he took a complete 180 and decided to do a very different film a few years later. He put all his resources in a big epic movie called Intolerance. He believed it would be backed by the moving industry that abandoned him largely after the negativity, the negative publicity of Birth of a Nation, and he hoped to gain their trust back with this new story that looked at the effects of intolerance in history, from the fall of Babylon and the crucifixion of Jesus and events around the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, where the persecution of French Huguenots, the Protestants against the Catholics, and a modern day story of a person who was wrongfully imprisoned. And he turned and entwined all four of these stories into one big epic feature-length film. It was quite ballsy, actually. It was the longest movie by far that's ever been created, and people came from all over to see the huge sets being built in Hollywood. People came from all over, carpenters and to work on this set. And as you see in the reading in chapter 3, or it was talking about the labor strikes going on in this time period. This was right in the middle of all that. This big scenes being built and the expenses being paid for this huge movie. So read Silent Agitators, that covers the strikes and labor movements that occur the same period of this movie. Intolerance itself was an absolute complete flop, and it was just too cut up, didn't make sense to the audience, and it was an absolute failure. In fact, the amount of money he spent on it left him in financial ruin for the rest of life that he was never able to truly recover from. To help get him back on his feet, though, Griffith decided to form a new partnership of movie making with a little group you might have heard of called Paramount, and also worked with a guy named Charlie Chaplin, who we'll get into next week, and a famous actor of the time, Mary Pickford, and another director, Douglas Fairbanks, all of whom mentioned in the readings. Be sure to read those. And we're going to again look at Charlie Chaplin in depth next week. And together, the four of them formed a new company called United Artists, also still around today. Chapter 3 talks about this alliance and how together they fought against the Victorian values and was the vanguard of something new. Major contributors to the development of the sex symbol in America and how to really sell sex to the audiences in America and beyond. They also created the actor itself. Before Griffith, the actor wasn't really a name. In fact, they weren't even credited in the films. But by creating the close-up and giving the face in that close-up, in that film, a name, people in the audience looking at that and saying, who is that? I want to be like that person. Or from that, the star was born. And among the first, again, Mary Pickford, who's formed this alliance and is talked about in the reading, she was mentioned in magazines all around the country as being the most beautiful person and the most popular girl in the world. And they all loved her. She was famous. She was a household name, and all because of movies for the first time. With her and others like Mary Pickford, the image of the woman began to shift from the Victorian virtues of a woman waiting at home for her man to a new woman, a woman that had to take care of herself as the men were away fighting war in Europe in World War I. A woman that could stand up for herself, had a mind of her own, that could fix a car, but fix it with class and beauty and femininity. But to do so, she could also drink and engage in a conversation while still remaining feminine. She was able to smoke long, thin cigarettes and act as her own individual person. We call this now and became famous as the 1920s Flapper Girl, but the Flapper Girl, with her bobbed hair, skimpy shirt, and vivacity and strong independence, is all really largely a product of Hollywood. For the first time, Hollywood is ahead of the scene and developing a new woman. One contemporary of the 20s said in an interview during the time that movies had often made me dissatisfied with my neighborhood because when I see a movie, the beautiful castle, the palace, the beautiful houses, I wish my home was something like these. I daydream about the clothes, the ideas, the furnishings, and the manners of the movie stars. I wish I was more like them, she said. For the first time, you really get a glimpse of how movies is affecting culture and affecting the dress and affecting the speech, people trying to talk and using lingo that they see in the films once we get into talkies. But this is all a product of the early film, product of Griffith and the people around him, the product of Charlie Chaplin, as we will see next week in many of his comedies, and the image of the tramp. But is the images that we see and the images you're going to see in our first movie next week, are they really all that foreign? Does our culture today say something similar to the culture that was being brought forward in film? What is the zeitgeist of the time then? And are there anything that still resemble that today? The spirit of the age, how much of it has changed over time? And how much of it is completely different, and we're going to see for the very first time as we watch our first silent film next week.